Hello and welcome back to CST 2120. So in this lecture I'm going to cover JavaScript testing. So as I explained in the previous lecture, in unit testing we write functions that execute the code we want to test, and the tests check that the functions return the right results, or in some cases that the database has been changed appropriately or the class state's been modified appropriately. And often we have to modify the code to make it easier to test, because if it's just like everything's mixed up in some big function, then we can't sort of test it. And so, for example, on the front end, it's better if we import external separate JavaScript files containing our functionality, because then we can then import those same JavaScript files into our test and test them there. Or in server-side code, if we split out the database functionality, then we can test that separately from the web service functionality, or the express functionality. So now this lecture is covering JavaScript unit testing. There's a lot of frameworks out there that are used for JavaScript unit testing. There's Mocha, Jasmine, QUnit, and quite a lot of other ones, So in this one I'm going to focus on Mocha and Chai. It's pretty popular. It's fairly easy to use once you get the hang of it. So Mocha is the kind of test framework, and then Chai is used to make assertions about the different, what you're expecting, the data structures to be like and all this kind of stuff, So we can use Mocha and Chai to test client-side JavaScript, server-side JavaScript, and also we can use it to test web services. So I'm going to go through each of those in detail, starting with the client-side JavaScript. So the first thing you need to think about when you're setting up your tests is the file organization. You should never mix up your testing code with your actual production code, because you want to be able to separate it. You don't necessarily want the test to be visible to all the public on your live server, right? So if you put it in a separate folder, you can choose which ones you actually move into the live production environment. And as I explained, you often have to reorganize, or what's called refactor, your main code to facilitate testing. I'm just going to use a simple example. I'm just going to run through it all, and then obviously I hope you'll be able to apply that to your own code for your own coursework. So in this example, I'm going to have I've written an email validation function, and I put it in a separate file, and this is where the file organization part becomes important, so that you can then use that to import the validation into your code that is, like for registration or something like that. But then I can also import that same function into my test code. So the most important thing is I've written my validation function, which is very, very simple really, and I've exported that function so I can use it in my client-side code and in my tests. So here's my simple validation function, right? It's just a regex and runs tests against the email, and it'll return true if the email is valid and false if the email is invalid. And I'm exporting that function from this file validation.js, and then in my client-side code, I can then import that into my code. And the client-side code basically consists of, the standard sort of input field and a button. And then I've got a module. So script type module means I can use the import and the export statements. So obviously I can do script and then source, and then that will basically copy and paste that script into my client-side code. But in many ways it's nicer using modules that provide more capability to kind of selectively import the different functions that I want. So here if I don't use module, I can't use the import syntax. So that's why I'm using module here. So I'm importing the function, in this case validate email, from this validation file here, validation.js. And because I'm in a module, that doesn't give me global scope. In a standard script, right, I can just access, if I write a function in a standard script, I can then reference that function here outside of the script. But because it's a module, everything within this module only has module scope rather than global scope. So this is why I need to do window.register. So window is a global object within here. So I can do window.register, which is kind of the same as just saying function register, right? Because if I try and do onClick equals register and just call, say, function register here, it doesn't work, because this is limited to the scope of this particular module, So instead I have to do window register, but it's basically the same thing. I'm creating a function called register with global scope that does all this sort of standard stuff about, getting the email and calling validate email, So the important thing to think about really is that in my actual code that I'm running, my registration code, I'm importing the validation function and using it here, That's the really crucial thing as far as that goes, And obviously I need to set this up here, do it in this way rather than just, so that I can handle the problem of the register function being in the scope of the whole document coming. So this is my register. I'll give you a little demo of that later. It's absolutely standard stuff from coursework 1. Now we can then write the unit test to check that register is actually working. Yeah. So now we've got our register is exporting this validate email function. So now we can import that into our tests. We can execute the validate email function with different arguments, and we can make assertions about what we're expecting the result to be under the to make sure that the function's behaving correctly. Yeah. So this is my test validation example, right? So in this case, I'm importing the function I want to test. Then I import expect from Chai, and as I'll explain, I kind of link that. This is linked in the page, in my test page, so that this will actually exist, kind of thing. And then I have this kind of complicated wrapper thing that Mocha uses, which I'll cover in a little bit. Yeah. So the wrapper, we have a sort of wrapper test validate email. Yeah, that's it, right? So they have this kind of describe, just basically copy this syntax. Yeah, I mean, you know, just it's the same for all tests using Mocha Chai. So you just basically copy that framework, the boilerplate, and then put your tests inside it. Yeah, we're obviously giving it appropriate arguments like whatever the test is and explain what the test should do. Yeah. So within this test, that's what test looks like. We then create some valid and invalid test emails, right? So some emails that are incorrectly formatted and some that are correctly formatted. And then we work through these and then we have this expect from Chai that says that we're expecting when we call this function that will equal false because these are all the bad emails here, and we're expecting the good emails to always equal true when we pass them through the validator. Yeah. So when the tests are done, so these are the assertions about what should happen. And you must have these, yeah? A test without assertions is not a test, you won't get any marks for it, yeah? You must make assertions saying this should happen, or this should not happen, or this value should be like this, or this should be a Boolean, or whatever it is, yeah? When the test is done, you have a callback function that's passed into the test. We call that to say we're all finished, yeah? And so this test validation, that's our testing code here. To actually run it, this is client-side code here. So we're going to build a test HTML page that has links to the JavaScript and CSS files, has a div to hold the test results, and what it does is it'll initialize Mocha, run the test, and display the results of the test. Yeah, and this test has to run on a file, or you're going to, on a server, sorry. Otherwise, you're going to get a cross-origin request error, and I'll show you what that means. Yeah. Okay, so this is my test HTML page, and so I'm linking into the Mocha style sheet, so I can get the nice Mocha styles on that. And then I'm linking to the Mocha JavaScript library so I can import Chai and run the tests. And then I've got a div that holds the test with a certain ID. And then this is like, you know, setting up Mocha, just basically copy this framework. Then we import the function we want to test. And because it's got all that syntax on it, if you remember all this describe stuff, Mocha will recognize that and run that as a Mocha test, yeah? And then we have the Mocha run, and it'll look for all of the tests that are on the page, it'll execute them and display the results in that page. Yeah? And these have to be modules so we can import them and make them work like that. Yeah. Okay, and then we should, if it's worked, get something like this on our test HTML page. In this case, it tells us, got the nice tick there showing the test is run, and this is what you'd need to include as a screenshot to prove that your client-side JavaScript tests are actually working. Yeah. So let's just have a little look through that, and I will provide some example code in addition to this lecture. Yeah, so this is my client unit test example here. Just check it's running. Yeah, okay. So here I've got here's my actual code, right? So this I don't need this here for the moment. So here's my website, right? Register, and I've got an external function validate email, which I'm importing here within this script module. Yeah. And then this is using that function in the real code kind of thing, yeah? Now in a separate folder called tests, as I said, you should always separate out your test code from your actual website code. I probably wouldn't even put it in the same folder, but just for example, I put it, just because it's an example, I've left it in here, yeah? And then here's my actual test code, right? I'm importing the function I want to test. I'm getting Chai reference to chai.expect, and I can get that because in my test one, I've got a link to the Chai libraries here, so that's actually exists on the page then when I'm running the tests. And then you've got this kind of boilerplate stuff, this describe, which is basically a wrapper for each test, and as long as you've got the correct wrapper, Mocha will automatically find and run those tests for you. And then I'm, got a bunch of good emails and bad emails, and I'm running the test, yeah? So to actually execute the test, so here's let's just look at the page itself, yeah? So this is the website actually running the code. So if I type D, click on register, it says email not valid. If I do d@d.com, then it says registration okay. So this is using that regex to check that my input fields are correct, yeah? Now, if I try and run now remember I've got this test example here. I've got this now to run the test. I need to run test HTML. So here I'm running test HTML from the local file system here, okay? But if I run it from the local file system, I get this kind of cross-origin request or cross-origin resource sharing error, and the test won't run, yeah? But if I run it from live server, then that works fine, right? Or you could run it from your, better to run it from live server, I think. Then it can import the other JavaScript files and it all works fine, yeah? So now if I run test HTML, then it tells me, it should return true if the email format's correct, and so that's passed. And just to show you it is actually working, it's always a good idea to make your tests fail just to make sure that they're working, right? So if I change the format of this, like put a space in or something, then that should fail the test. And you can see here we've got a test error here because this is actually an invalid email, not a valid email. And if I return it to a correct email, you can see here now the test passes again, yeah? Okay, so the next thing I want to cover is testing server-side JavaScript. So again, we're going to use Mocha and Chai here, and because it's server-side JavaScript, we need the modules to be, we can't just link to the JavaScript files in our HTML page. Instead, we're going to use npm to install Mocha Chai, and you probably also need Chai HTTP if you're installing web services, yeah? Again, if all of your database code is mixed up with your web service and Express code, then it's going to be much harder to test, probably impossible to test, without really messing about a lot. So it's much better to split out the functionality into different files and then import the functionality into your Express application and also import your functionality into your tests, yeah? So again, we create a separate folder called tests, put those tests in there. And to make this work on Node, we need to configure package.json so that npm can run the test with Mocha, yeah? And then once we configure package.json, we can just type npm test at the root of the application, and it'll run those tests and display the results for us, yeah? So in package.json, you have a test, in scripts, you have a test section. Now you could just put Mocha, but I found, and this, not an expert on this, but I found that if I just leave it as Mocha, the tests don't ever exit, it just kind of hangs. And that seemed to be the case regardless of whether I shut things down correctly or whether it was a simple case or not, yeah? So if you put the --exit as an argument to Mocha, then it always sort of shuts itself down. It's just a bit easier to run those tests, yeah? But there may be sort of wheels within wheels here, and maybe it's not necessarily the best practice, so you might want to look into that if you'll get serious about this, yeah? So I've got a little example here. So I've added the database. So remember in previous lectures I gave you the simple kind of web application example. Here I put some database functionality into it so I can actually explain the testing properly, yeah? So I've got a separate file called database.js that exports the database functions, and then I'm importing those into my web server so I can use those to deliver the web service, yeah? So I'm not going to go through all these details. I went through all this in the Node.js and MongoDB lecture, but the important thing here is that there's a couple of functions here, get all users and add user, that do the MongoDB database functionality for me, yeah? And the important thing here is in my database.js, I'm exporting those functions so that they can be used by my server when I set up a path to return all users, for example. So here's my server. Again, I'm not going to go through the details here. What matters is that I'm importing my database functions. Here I'm doing import star as DB, which means that all the functions that are exported from database will be copied into this DB object so that I can type db.getAllUsers, and then that'll execute the getAllUsers function from this file here, yeah? And then in my test code, I can do the same thing, right? Oh yeah, so sorry, in my server, I'm obviously using these functions like db.getAllUsers to get all the users, which I'm then returning to the client, yeah? So my test, I can then import those functions as well, or again as a DB object. I can then set up the Chai library, so remember I have to install the Chai module, and then here I'm only using expect, I think, but I've just shown you can import like the shoulds and the, asserts and all this kind of stuff, yeah? Then we have this same kind of wrapper as for the client-side code, in which we have the describe and all this kind of stuff. I think it's slightly less messy than the client-side code, but same basic idea, describing the test, and you can say what the test should do and all this kind of stuff. And then I'm going to go through each of these tests. Sorry, I'm going to go through the first test, just explain it as an example, yeah? And this example code will be available on the course website, yeah? So to test the getAllUsers function, for example, yeah, so we do have all the it stuff here. So we've imported the function, remember, covered that earlier, and then we're going to call that function to get some results, yeah? And then what we're going to do, and that's an async function, so it returns a promise, and we're using the await syntax here. So in this case, we have to put it inside an async function, yeah? So this will not work. You won't be able to call await db getAllUsers unless you put the async keyword in. Then we can, now we call this function, it should, if it's working, return all the users, and then we can make some assertions about what's returned. For example, we can make an assertion that it should be an array, and that if it's, you know, an array, by this stage it should be an array, so we can make assertions about the structure of the objects in the array, like they should all have the property name and age. Yeah? And to make this test work, obviously we need to have MongoDB server running, because this is a database test and it's actually calling database functions here. Yeah? An add user is a slightly different test here. So we want to check in this case that when we call the add user, it will add a particular user to the database. And one way to do that is to create a user that we're pretty confident is never going to exist in the database. I could have used like a unique ID method here, but I just use a very simple way of generating a random name. Yes, I've generated a random name that I'm pretty confident is unique in the database, and I've just given them a random age of 1. Yeah. So then I call the function to add the user to the database and make an assertion that at least one user has been added to the database, that the function's actually worked correctly as I'm expecting. And to double check that, I've actually run a separate check, not using my method, my functions, but using the functions of the MongoDB client to check that there's actually the user has been correctly added to the database. And then this is really important. When we finish the test, we've put some junk in the database. We need to take that junk away. Otherwise, it's going to potentially, you know, interfere with other tests and just create a load of mess for other people who are sharing my development environment and my test environment. So I want to get rid of that junk I just put in the database by using MongoDB to delete it. Yeah. And then if you run that test using npm test, then we should get a nice sort of screenshot showing all the results. Yeah. So let's just do a little demo here. Okay, so let's just remember what I've got to do. Okay, so that's my client-side tests. So here are my server-side tests. So here's my server. Let's start with that. Yep, no, let's start with the database, actually. So here's my database. So this is all the stuff I covered in the lecture on MongoDB and Node.js. So the important thing here is obviously I'm exporting a couple of functions that do database functionality with MongoDB, and obviously could do some extra stuff if I wanted to. Yeah, basically these are quite simple wrappers, but I could add some extra functionality if I wanted. Yeah. Then my server is importing these database functions, okay, and then it's calling them. Remember, we set up the different paths to build our web service, and then it's calling these functions in order to deliver the web services kind of thing. Yeah, like add user or getAllUsers here. Yeah, but I want to test these functions separately. So what I'm doing here is I've got a test folder here, okay, and here's my test database method, and so here I'm importing these functions into here. Here's my sort of tests. And then I'm, you know, calling the functions and making assertions about those functions. Yeah. And as I explained earlier, we need to put test. We need to do test. Oh yeah, we can specify the test directories here, by the way. Yeah. So I've noticed that, but that means obviously you can put the test completely separate from the main code, which is obviously better practice. But at the moment, it's just a subdirectory for ease of use. Yeah. So here I've added the test to package.json so that it'll actually work and run. Yeah. So that's the file structure, and I think to run it, yeah, I'll do it npm test. So it's calling test, and then you can see here, these are the two tests I've just run now. We'll come to this one in a second. So it's getting all users, should return users, and should add a user to the database, yeah? And just to show you that it's working, sorry, I'm into that. Then if we go to test database, if we put a property that doesn't exist on that's incorrect, yeah, we run the test, then we get an error and we get some explanation about what that error is, yeah. So here I haven't got Compass up, but I obviously have to have MongoDB running the server, otherwise the whole thing won't work because it's a database test, yeah. And so in this case, all my users have the property name and age. That's correct. But if I try and make an assertion about something that doesn't exist in my user objects, then the test will break, yeah. All right, so the third kind of test I want to cover here is testing web services. And we can also use Mocha and Chai for this, yeah? And to make this work, you need to install the Chai HTTP module. And then instead of exporting the functions, we export the Express app that we've set up with our server. We import that into the test. And then when we use Chai to send get, post, etc. to different paths of the web service, we make assertions about the results, yeah? So here's my web service, very similar to the one I demonstrated in earlier lectures. That's the path, and that's the kind of data that should be returned by the web service when we go to /users. Yeah. In my my server.js, instead of just doing constant app equals express, I want to export that app. I'm still using it in the same way, but I'm exporting it so I can import it into my test. And then need to configure package.json again, and then we import the app from the server.js into my test, in this case called test web services. Yeah. We also need to use the Chai HTTP module to be able to send get, post, put, delete, etc. And then we have our tests, which look pretty much the same as the other kinds of tests, except the difference here is that to ping the web service, we do this Chai request.get, and presumably could do post, delete, etc., which I haven't tried myself. So we send a get request, use Chai to send a get request to that path, and then we get back error and response in the callback, and then we can make we'll get back a couple of the error and the response, and then we can make assertions to make sure, well, okay, we have actually the errors, no error set, the response is status of 200, and then we can make other assertions. We get response objects and make assertions similar to the database test that we're going to say, well, what come back from the web service should contain a name, an array of objects, and each one should have a name and an age field, yeah? And when just the same as the other tests, when the test is done, we get a callback function called done, call done to tell Mocha that the test is finished. So let's just finish this. Okay, so there's the web service. I think I've demoed that already, really. We go to users, and we get all the users from the database, yeah? I want to mess it up. Don't worry about that, I can demo that. Okay, and we test it within Node, right? So if we do npm test, and so this here is the test of the web service, and so I've got test web service here. And so we're pinging the web service and, making these various assertions about it. And if we broke it, it would, give us something that it was broken. Yeah, same as the other tests, yeah? Okay, I think that'll do. All right, so in coursework 2, you have to write some JavaScript tests. There's 1 mark per test. You get half marks if you write the test but don't document the results, or if the tests fail, yeah? These tests can be a combination of client-side unit tests, server-side unit tests, or web service tests. I've demonstrated each one of these, and I'll provide example code along with this lecture. They've got to be meaningful tests, right? There's no assertions, it's not a test, so you must have assertions in these tests, and they must be testing things that are actually required to make your coursework run. Yeah? If they're not used by your social networking application, you just wrote them so you could test them, then you're not going to get any marks on them. Yeah? Your test must pass, and your submission must include both the test code and screenshots of the results of the test. So this lecture covered unit tests for client-side JavaScript, unit tests for server-side JavaScript, and JavaScript web service tests. Yeah, so the unit test should be covering like testing a particular method or function in your code, yeah, and checking that it returns the right results, modifies database, or changes the class structure, whatever, yeah. The web service test should be pinging particular paths, possibly with combinations of different query parameters to make sure that the web service is returning the appropriate results. Mocha Chai is very popular JavaScript testing framework, very easy to use. Personally, I recommend you use that, but you're welcome to use a different one if you want. You're almost certainly going to have to rewrite your code a bit to make it testable, but that's probably a good thing. It'll make it more modular, and you'll be able to pick up errors much more easily. Your coursework test must pass, okay? Half marks for failed tests, and you must include a screenshot with the test results in your project report. If you don't document the results, we'll assume that your tests have failed, yeah? And that's it.